Hello, welcome everybody. We are here at Space Cowboy Books Online this evening with Jonathan Nevair, celebrating the new editions of the Wind Tide Trilogy. We're going to hear a little excerpt from each book, and we're also going to get into a Q&A. If anyone in the audience has questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat. We'll try to get to them all. Jonathan Nevair is a science fiction writer and, as Dr. Jonathan Wallace, an art historian and professor of art history at Moore College of Art and Design in Philadelphia. After 2 decades of academic teaching and publishing, he finally got up the nerve to write fiction. Jonathan grew up in Long Island, New York, but now resides in Southeast Pennsylvania with his wife and a rambunctious mountain feist, cricket. We're going to start off the evening with an excerpt from Book 1, Goodbye to the Sun. Hand it over to Jonathan.
All right, thanks so much, Jean-Paul. I appreciate it and glad to be back. It's always great to be at Space Cowboy Books. Thanks to everyone for coming. I'm going to read a short chapter in first-person voice that is Razor speaking, which is actually a kind of a reflective moment, talking about a situation that the two of them, she and Keen, are in. So I'm going to start with that. Pox. The mere thought of her shudders my bones. Keen's nemesis was no simple villainous rival. She was sheer terror incarnate, a reminder that evil didn't just blossom along political lines or through fierce competition for interstellar power. It also worked freelance. Not much time remained after the tide abated. We had to move fast or nothing would be left to fight for. The Targetians didn't know our location, but they had the general idea. Free of their need to adhere to the diasporic clause, their dogma was thrown off their shoulders with the arrogance of a prince disrobing in the presence of servants. It was only a matter of days before they narrowed their search and located the subterranean refuge. To stand and fight against the larger force, one with so-called justice on their side, was futile. We were sure to be wiped out, lost forever in the sands of imperialist expansion and colonial domination. Yet, what was the alternative? To run and hide? How many times can one cower against conceded power and not become weakened into submission? A time comes when everyone must take a stand. Despite Ertani's resistance, my remaining brethren sided with Crest. We would do just that, cower one last time. If it worked, it'd be a feint to draw them in before we pounced. We'd appear to be a small, insignificant threat, on the run, despite desperate to survive against a growing world of so-called progress. But if Crest and I returned with a sizable force, we might lure them in enough to blow over them like an unscheduled tide wave. If the effort failed, we'd join those who'd fallen under colonial circumstances in the Sagarm. Our history would be written by others. We'd be spoken of as primitives, preserved in the annals not as ourselves, but as fabrications, molded through a distorted lens of power. It was decided at the pools. Crest had tragedy on his side. Everyone had lost loved ones on our failed raid on Targite City. Trust came to Crest not through victory, but failure and defeat. The plan was set. Our remaining people would ride the river hidden with hopes that the lore told truth. How long a journey it was and where the shelter of the ancients stood was now a fated answer for those drifting underground to silent and unknown subterranean shores. Ertani would lead them. Crest, my sibling Gouchette and I, along with Keen and a small squad led by Celtic, would make for the closest turbine field. The decision would cause a rift between our people. Loved ones would be left behind. Crest's companion, Tinuti, would stay to care for their young child. I put light years between myself and my own children. Celtic too was leaving a life partner. What would this cut, this void of distance between us need to heal? Outside medicine? Stitches? Time? It was a roll of the dice, but it was the only way we'd get off the planet and on to Haroon. If successful, it meant trusting that a desperate ambassador would make good on his word. Something Crest said to me at the throat pool, the first night I'd returned, lingered in my head. I couldn't shake it loose. He's not the person you think he is, Razor. He can help us, Crest, even if he's only doing it for his benefit. Crest shook his head, one eye closed. Don't be fooled, he said. He suffers greatly. It shows like a desert flower at tide's coming. And what of it, I said. The Drek should, considering what part he's played in our suffering. Crest knelt and ran his hand over the still glowing blue water. Faint ripples spread across the surface. Small waves widened as they crossed the pool and broke on the far side, their delicate splashes echoing off the cavern's ceiling and walls. How right he was.
Thank you. That was an excerpt from Goodbye to the Sun, book 1 in the Wind Tide Trilogy. We'll hear from the rest of the series later. So these 3 books all came out in 1 year, which is an amazing feat for a space opera writer. What were the biggest challenges in writing the sequels in the trilogy? And when writing space opera, how do you keep track of such massive world building, or in this case, I should probably say universe building?
Yeah. So I think the first question around writing sequels, the difficulty for me with the sequels was focused on 2 things. One of them was the idea of narrative closure. The first book was written with that standard querying line that I know my fellow authors, who I recognize already in the audience, will be familiar with, which is standalone with serious potential. And so that means writing a story that has its own sense of closure, but leaves the door open for something more. And because of that, you know, that first book had a kind of a complete cycle, that it went through a complete narrative and reached a resolution, but needed to leave the door open to something else. And unlike, I think, a normal trilogy or more standardized trilogy, where it's like, we're going to stop the story here, leave you hanging, do enough to feel that you've had a sense of resolution, but there's still the same characters at work and on the move. I had a situation where, for the most part, the characters in the first book had served their purpose in the overall story, and I needed to introduce new characters, and I needed to build a new separate tale and do the same thing with the third book. And so I took that anthology series approach, which was very hard. It was basically like, I'm going to write 3 books. Each of them can stand by themselves, but yet together they kind of, with an umbrella, form an Act 1, an Act 2, and an Act 3. But yet within them, they each have their own kind of standard act structure that reaches a resolution. And so that was difficult to do. The other real problem I had with writing those books as sequels was timeline. I also, in a way, made it difficult for myself, because the first book has a weird situation where the character of Razor is writing a reflective memoir type narrative of the events. And so you have this epistolary almost approach, where 60 years after the events, the Razor is reflecting on what's already happened, and then taking you through the story lifetime as it unfolds through the perspective of the other main character, Keen. And so as a result of that, the book is already placed in a future that you're then putting the car in reverse back to the past as you're making your way through it. And so the question was, well, then what's the future for the book 2 and book 3? And how does that relate to that time frame? And that was hard. So I kind of had to do a lot of math. And some of the math I had to make adjustments. It was like, oh, okay, well, I'll just make this 20 years later. Well, wait a minute, Jadi's 85 now. That's going to be a problem, because this character of Jadi, I need at a certain age for the story. Some characters are quite old. Aridus is 91 in the second book. He's Keen's father. But I had some other characters that I needed to bump up to a certain age so that they could function more in an adult capacity. And so that age timeline was really hard to negotiate. And I literally had to do number crunching. Like, I had to sit down with a calculator and go through and say, okay, well, you know, Ilo is 16, or so she thinks, in book 2. Well, in book 3, that's going to make her, you know, 36. Okay, that works. Well, if she's 36, how old is, you know, Nisi in book 3? Whoa, this is a problem. Nisi's too old. Nisi would no longer be alive. So now I need to back this up a little bit and adjust those time frames. That was really hard. That was a really difficult thing to do, was to play around with those time frames, because I kind of shot myself in the foot a little bit by starting the book with the ending. We were talking before we started, Jean-Paul, about Christopher Rocchio, right? And Empire Silence, he kind of does that too, right? He kind of sets out really sort of starting from the position of the end and then taking you back through it. And I did that as well. And it was wonderful for the first book. But after then, I got really contracted at the time and offered to write the 3 books, then it was like, well, now I have to figure out how to work through that. So that was difficult.
So when world building on future books, are you going to start with a chronology before you begin writing? How will you do this differently moving forward?
Yeah, I don't know. I did start with a chronology with this series, actually. Even before I had books 2 and 3, I wrote a back history prior to the time period of Goodbye to the Sun. And, you know, I like that. I mean, like, it's one of the reasons why I like writing science fiction and secondary worlds is I like creating those vast epics. And so I actually wrote, you know, there's a system known as spans in the Wind Tide universe, which are like epics. And so there's the first span, the second span, and the third span. And the Wind Tide books take place in the third, towards the end of the third span. And so I actually went back and wrote what happened in the first and the second before I wrote the story of Goodbye to the Sun. And it was really a great exercise. You know, you kind of write all around and behind the story, but it really helped me to position where they were in history. And it made it easier for me, I think, to jump into books 2 and 3. That really helped because it was just continuing on those references. And I do that a lot. In the first book, I talk a lot about the Patent War, and there's some flashbacks to the Patent War, but you really don't experience the story through the Patent War, but it's such an important component of the book. I needed to go back and kind of write, okay, here's what happened. And here's how that relates to what happened before that. And this is how this age came about from the last age and the one that cycled before it. And that was really fun to do. And I think it created a nice backbone to the series. Will I do it again? I don't know. It might just be a natural thing that I end up doing as a writer when I sit down to create a larger cycle again. Maybe that'll happen. I'm writing a standalone right now, and I didn't do it for that because I didn't feel that it needed those kinds of historical sort of roots of breadth.
Well, it worked very well, so I hope to see more of that. So when world building, what order do you create your worlds in? Do you start with setting? Do you start with character?
Yeah.
Do you start with history, as you mentioned? How do you go about this? And is this something that's in flux with you? Will you begin on different books in different places, or do you have a regimented way of handling this?
Yeah, I think it's in flux. I think each of those comes into play at different times. So, you know, I think setting is probably one of the most important things for me. Oftentimes I'm very imagist in a lot of ways. It's probably, you know, I mean, that's what I do for a living too, is right. I mean, I talk about and teach and write about art, visual art. So I'm very visual. So I definitely see settings and places. And sometimes I just know I need a setting and I'm going to use it, but I don't know where. Like in the second book, I knew there was going to be a biosphere. I saw it, and a space station with this bountiful, fecund, natural, biodiverse sort of, you know, terrarium-like environment. I knew that was getting in there somewhere, but I didn't know when. But it was gonna be a part of it. So sometimes it's that. Other times I think it's character. You know, just starting with a character, and as you start to think about their experience, it kind of, I think, builds up the world and the environment around them and the conflicts. And then from the conflicts, that kind of generates the politics. And from the politics, it generates the larger conditions. And that just, for me, sort of gets me into the social dynamics. And then you pit that particular world against, or culture against, another culture, and it kind of just starts a domino effect. I think that spreads itself outwards and builds from there. So sometimes it's character, sometimes it's setting. It's not often history for me, maybe, but I would say it really helped in the third book, because in the final book, No Song But Silence, I felt at that point there wasn't much world building going on. I was resting a lot on what had already happened, but I was really relying on the problems with what had happened in the past, and now figuring out how those were going to be tackled and addressed and overcome. So, you know, the history thing is, I think in the third one, is less of a world building, and it's more of the stage and the stage set that you're going to work within. to go forward. I guess that's the best way I can describe it. I don't know if that makes any sense at all. But sometimes I just see places or I feel things. I'm big on mood. I have to tell you, I feel like when I world build, it derives from mood more than anything. When I'm in places, when I'm out and doing things, it's about the feeling of where I am for me. And I always try to then articulate that through visual, olfactory smells and sounds and tastes, and mixing those together to kind of build up an environment, multisensory environment through writing.
I think that'd be a perfect time to share with us an excerpt from book 2, Jotty's Wager. And I want to point out something about this book too. I was just telling Jonathan, book 2 I often find is a low point in most series, where it is not as exciting as the first book. We're kind of a lot of lead up to book 3. In this trilogy, it is not a low point. It is a fantastic book, and just takes off running where book 2 left off. So high praise here from me on this book. I can't wait for Jonathan to share an excerpt. That being said, I'm going to hand it over to him.
So I am going to preface this one by saying, so this is a scene where Jotty, who is now the general of the People's Army, is with Ilo, who is basically the main character of book 2. She's a teenager. And they have just gone on a recruitment mission because this is a heist plot. So they got to go around and pick up all the different people they need for the team. And they're on Haroon, which is a tropical rainforest planet. They're in the back country. They've just gone and found someone named Nisi, who is a soldier, quite a rogue soldier, gets into a lot of trouble in her life. But Jotty has taken her under their wing. And they are just finished hanging out at a cantina. And Nisi is leaving, and Jotty and Ilo are about to depart back to the capital of Gantuk. Nisi is riding a K-speeder, which is kind of like a hover bike. We need to make the rounds and recruit a few others before the sit down, Jotty said. Nisi raised an eyebrow as she kicked the dilapidated speeder to life. Black smoke belched out the dual exhausts as the engine rattled. Get that thing out of here! Scorpy waved his bar towel from inside the cantina. It stinks! Nisi ignored him. She settled on the bike and revved the engine. The machine looked like a toy underneath her burly frame. Somehow it kept hovering off the ground despite the giant riding it. They'd sat for 2 more rounds of Canty ales and verbal sparring in the cantina. Ilo enjoyed every minute of it, absorbed in the humorous banter and razzing between her 2 companions. You ever finish that refurb job on the Classic K? Nisi yelled over the engine. She kept from stalling out with continuous twists on the throttle. Don't want to talk about it, Jotty said over the engine's rattle. Nisi turned to Ilo. She knew her face said it all. Oh, Nisi said and mouthed the word, awkward. Jotty leaned forward to examine the design plate on the side of Nisi's bike. Nice paint job. Appears to be thinning in spots. They ran a finger over the dusty silver frame. What? Nisi pumped the throttle. Can't hear you. There's a serial number underneath. I can't hear you. Nisi shook her head and pointed at her ear. She revved the clunker louder and winked at Ilo. See you, kid. Nisi switched into gear. The speeder shot down the road and into the air. The front handlebar and twin forks tilted up in a tireless wheelie. Ilo waved dirt and dust away from her face. Jotty coughed and swatted at the air as Scorpy's curses in Haronese echoed from inside the cantina. She is so cool, Ilo said as the dust cleared. Jotty, still coughing from Haroon's dust, started down the road. The 2 of you will be the death of me. Ilo skipped and hopped until she caught up with them. I mean, she's so... Ilo sidestepped next to Jotty. Can I bunk with her? Absolutely not. Why? Jotty's eyes connected with her. Because she is an adult and she's working. So am I. Ilo stopped and put her hands on her hips. Jotty ran a hand down their face. Just do me a favor, okay? Don't accept any invitations from Nisi. If she wants you to do something with her, just say, Jotty said I can't. But why? End the discussion, kiddo. I'm going to find a way to spend time with her, Jerem. Be careful. Make sure you respect Jotty. They've been forgiving thus far. Come here. Jotty waved her to follow them off the road onto a narrow dirt path leading into the rainforest. Their large frame passed through violet leaves and branches and vanished. Where are we going? A shortcut, Jotty's voice faded with the distance. You wanted to see the Cantonools, right? They called back. Ilo ran in after them. It took only a few hundred feet into the wilds of the Heronese rainforest, and Ilo entered another world. The road, the cantina, Gantuk, even the war. It all fell away. Ilo stood in awe. It switched to dense and lush rainforest as quickly, like crossing an invisible threshold. They'd stopped at a stand of Cantonools. Rising majestically around her, the prodigious trees rendered her speechless. Jotty didn't corrupt the silence with words. They let her take it all in. Ilo touched the tight skin of the bark. Her 2 fingers slid over the smooth surface. Again, an uncanny sensation of Haroon tingled her inner core. She wandered the grove, stopping to watch Nushaba's light flutter on the lower branches and purple plants on the forest floor. Light played on the veined leaves around her feet with hypnotizing rhythms. Jotty reached up and pulled down a branch. They plucked off one of the perennially blooming flower cups and handed it to Ilo. She cradled it in a hand with talismanic wonder and raised the orange and yellow cup to her nose and sniffed. The scent of marmish, piquant and tangy, tingled her nostrils. But here in the wild, in its raw form, something earthy and visceral lingered in the Cantanool nectar. It pulled Ilo back in time. She knew almost nothing about the history of the Sagittarius arm. She didn't need to. This was history primordial, a trigger hidden deep in human DNA. It told her one thing: Cantanool was old. It, or one of its close relatives elsewhere in the arm, had been a companion in the human ecosystem for millennia. The effect wasn't that different from the leavened bread she'd smelled back on Tarkasi 9. Bilky, the night shift food processor for the Civil Services Department, would give Ilo a loaf of bread out of the oven once a week. When she waited in the bakery and watched him work with the processors and mix the dough, that yeasty scent had a similar impact. The scent carried an intrinsic link to humanity. An uncanny flood of abstract memories from those weeks at dawn in the bakery returned, her nostrils inhaling the sourish, fermenting mounds on the counter. The olfactory experience sent her over the threshold of some alluring and unreachable history. Out here, in the natural landscape of Haroon, Ilo put together a greater understanding of humanity and its relationship to flora and fauna, the Cantonools, the clouds, the rain, the dirt, and the sea. She'd been living on the outside, at the fringe of a world politically and ecologically, and then it dawned on her. Politics and ecology were both alluring and exciting, and also potentially threatening or deadly. She'd felt pulled back to Fosk, to its natural phenomena of land and sky, but also the presence of politics made manifest in bodies lying dead on black grass, and those abducted. She lifted her nose from the flower cup. She'd traveled through a vast inner journey in the time it took to inhale and exhale the scent of a Cantanool's petals, but she'd returned with something that hadn't been there when she left, the memory of a note. And I'll stop there, although it goes on.
Thank you. That was an excerpt from Book 2, Jotty's Wager. So Book 2 has a coming of age thread, and many series often begin in this way, but you chose to use this device later in the series. What made you decide to go this route?
Yeah, so I was looking for a character. Again, you know, I knew Jotty was going to carry over into the second book, and I wanted Jotty to be a central character, but I also wanted a new character to join Jotty. And Jotty is such an interesting person. They're just a natural mentor. And I just felt like it was such an opportunity to have Jotty be a mentor to someone. And so there was a character that made a brief appearance in the first book in a bar scene as a small street kid who comes up to Keen and begs for some money. And I thought, wow, this is such an interesting moment and an opportunity. I thought, what if I could get that character back? And so I really thought, well, you know, what if she stows away on Jotty's ship when it's docked at the moon base? And that started this idea of, well, now I've got this, you know, potentially 15-year-old, scrappy kid basically joining up or stowing away and getting caught on Jotty's ship. And it just created the perfect situation for the mentorship of Jodi to play a role in that character. And I think that's where that coming of age story came from. And, you know, Ilo really does become the central characters of book 2 and book 3. Although there are always two main characters in my books, which is weird because I've realized this now. I seem to always use 2 characters. So it's Keen and Razor, Ilo and Jodi, Lazaro and Ilo in the 3rd book. And that really generated the idea of the coming of age story. And it turned into this wonderful opportunity to flesh out one of the favorite characters I've ever made, which is Jodi, who is just a person who lives beyond the pale and, you know, goes to the beat of a different drum in a way is ahead of their time. And that's what makes them a tragic character, is the world isn't ready for Jodi, unfortunately. And, you know, it becomes Ilo's job to kind of try to get the world there for Jodi in a way, in books 2 and 3. So that's the, you know, the coming of age story kind of came about as serendipity, really, out of that first book through the mentorship relationship.
And another really interesting device in book 2 that's related to the coming of age story is you use an imaginary friend, Jareb, if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Jareb, yeah.
As one of the narrators. What made you choose this device, and what issues came up using an imaginary narrator, which is a pretty unconventional?
Boy, that was a trip. Yeah, so, you know, I have to give credit to my wife for introducing me to the concept of internal family systems, which is a psychoanalytic theory, which, you know, the deal is Jareb was there in book 1. And Jareb was simply a device I had used to emphasize through, you know, show, not tell really, the tragedy of Ilo's circumstance as a lone child living on a dilapidated cold moon base. And there's a moment where that becomes really the most important trigger for Keen to try to get his shit together, basically, and to give up drinking and to kind of be a better person. And it's all because of this small moment where he hears a kid talk about an imaginary friend who keeps her comfortable and safe and happy when she's all alone. And, like, you know, it breaks my heart I broke my heart to write it. And, you know, that was just there already. And I thought, I really like writing internal experience, you know, like it's why Razor has that first person approach, is I really like getting into the internal subjective responses to events. And so this was another entryway to do that. And it was different. And so it was like, well, here's this opportunity to have an imaginary friend. And then there was this way in which the internal family systems brought about a whole structure and architecture to a level of subconscious within someone. And so I did a bunch of research on that, and realized that, you know, this is really a kind of like a network within the self, and that Jareb could be a kind of, as it's called, a manager. There are firefighters and exiles and managers and different components. And I thought, well, why doesn't Jareb rise from being just a manager that's a subconscious person to being a kind of coming up to the surface as an imaginary friend, and still be a manager for Ilo? And he does a job, as you know, you read it, Jean Paul, that there's moments where he denies her or distracts her from accessing things that are going to be traumatic, or trying to avoid things that are going to be problematic for her. And so he became this wonderful device to kind of add an internal struggle and complicate the character, but also give the reader a different depth of entry into the psychology of that main character. And it turned out to be a lot of fun to write Jareb, because it was kind of a way to tell that coming of age story in a way that was interesting, but then also about, you know, kind of Jodi becoming in a way a replacement for Jareb, and the two of them having different roles for Ilo through the story. But it came about through that particular theory of an internal family system. And I loved, I have to say, I see that one of my colleagues is here, Andrew, too, who can relate to this. One of the beauties of writing books quickly together is you can go back and you can make changes. And so I was able to go back and kind of tweak some foreshadowing and do some little tweaking in book one before it released to really strengthen the links to make Jerub more of a kind of like a bona fide presence in Ilo as a character. And there's a small coin she keeps with her that Keen gave her in book one. And I was able to go back and again, like, you know, do a little revision on that so that, you know, that was again, more specifically maybe strengthened as a thread through the different books.
I thought it was a really interesting move to actually allow the imaginary friend some narration space. You know, it's a different way of looking into somebody's subconscious than just a introspective passage. So that was really cool. Back to world building for a moment, because there's a lot of great world building in this book too. In your world building, how do you go about creating unique ecologies for each of your planet? And I wondered if you could tell us specifically about your inspiration for the Cantanul trees, which play such a central role in a lot of the people's lives.
Ecologies and ecosystems generally, you know, I'm just very, I like to take walks and I'm huge on woods and trees, especially in forests, partly because of where I live. So that's an easy win for me. You know, I'm immersed in that on a daily basis. You know, my dog Cricket makes me be out in the woods all the time. So that one is easy, but I'm also just, you know, pretty invested in ecology generally and interested in it. And so coming up with different environments is something that I really enjoy, dreaming up different environments. And I really like to push the boundaries of the possible in a speculative environment with things like color. And so I find it very fun to just dream up and imagine different possibilities. You know, like if you go way back to my childhood, you know, I saw Star Wars: A New Hope in the theater as a small boy. And I remember, I said this one other time, I remember that moment when I first saw the binary star on Tatooine. And it was just like, wow, you know, I mean, like, you know, the moon last night here was fabulous. It was amazing. But, you know, two moons, right? You know, or what about three? And so, you know, Haroon has 3 moons. And I thought, you know, this is so much fun. One of them is a fractured moon that's now become twins. The other one is Ron. And, you know, I just start running with those things. And I was able to create an entire calendar system with a set of holidays off of a moon cycle. And the whole Ron cycle and this idea of the moon staying over the horizon after sunrise for X number of hours during a certain, you know, period of weeks. And the idea of people using that as an opportunity to be silent and not speak, to kind of commune and to reflect, just kind of grows out of that relationship of a human being in an ecological setting and how the two interact. And it goes back to what I said about mood to me. Like I want to create the ecology to match the mood that I want the characters to be in the story, so that the person in the reading it can go there. Like I want you to be in the blue dunes, in the rosy sky, you know, and I want you to feel the heat and feel like you're there. You know, I love VR. When I've had an opportunity to look at a VR, put a VR system on, you know, and go into these environments that, you know, just they're so fantastical, but you feel like you're there. That's a thrill to me, and I think that's what the world building is about to me. It's about an opportunity to do that. And the Cantanuls, same thing. The Cantanuls are an amazing part of Haronese culture. And I love the idea of taking something that's a part of the natural ecosystem and developing it outwards so that it kind of continuously unfolds and evolves to become a central part of a cultural experience. So the Cantanul, the marmish becomes a spice for food. The leaves get brewed into teas, and beer is made from the Cantanul. You can have a Canty beer or a Canty tea. You know, the wood itself is used for most of the architecture in Gantuk and in other parts of that world. And I really like that idea of taking a tree, which is, so historically, has that age to it, right? It has that kind of like that wisdom to it. And I like that. And I like attaching that to a culture and a place. And the Cantonal is inspired by two specific trees, in case anyone's interested. A beech tree, which I love, the tight bark of a beech trunk. It's like, it's so tight on the bark, on the wood, you can't even peel the bark of a beech tree. Everyone loves to carve their initials in beech trees because it's like literally that tight bark. And tulip poplars, which are a local tree we have here, which are towering, majestic trees that rise very high, and they have these beautiful flower cups on them that are orange and yellow in the spring. And those are kind of an inspiration for the Cantonal cups that produce the Marmish nectar.
Sounds like a lovely tree. At this point, if you don't mind, share with us an excerpt from book 3, No Song But Silence. I have so many questions, but I can't give the audience spoilers on this.
Oh, okay.
If you don't mind, share a little excerpt from book 3 with us.
Yeah, this is a funny one because it's interesting that you said that, because I'm struggling to think of what I want to read from here because of spoilers. You do want to be careful. So I think what I'm going to do is read a very short, just about like 2.5 pages of the absolute beginning of the book, which introduces a new character. The location is Col 2, the desert planet. And we are in the desert. We're about 180 miles southeast of Targite City, or as they're known, the Finns. Sarat Akimsho held the voice tablet close to his lips and drew in a breath, words waiting on his tongue. Onyx-skinned fingers tightened their grip on the recording device. Speak it. It is time. The blazing light of Alteron, Koltu's rosy sun, beat down atop the dune's crest. He stood, frozen by an internal paralysis, despite the heat of the endless blue desert. Do it. His jaws clenched, rows of teeth like prison walls denying the escape of words. Alteron's merciless rays pushed through his skin, fighting to melt his resistance. I can't. He lowered his hand. With relief, he strode along the sand ridge, weather-beaten sandals dangling from his other hand and swinging to the rhythm of his gait. Col 2's signature terrain gave way under his feet, cerulean sand cascading down the shaded leeward face of the serpentine peak. Once more, fear served as protectorate from what must be said. You hide in the shadows, behind veils, yet you walk the sands in the light. Stop being a contradiction and a coward. Sarat halted. Ice blue eyes scanned the desert expanse. In every direction, rolling dunes met an uninterrupted, cloudless pink sky. Think of those who have spoken out before you, those of the future who will not if you don't do your part. His hand rose to his lips, a finger triggering the recording device. The elders are wrong about Col 2. The words had escaped. Silence returned, his statement vanishing into the arid emptiness. The desert's Spartan beauty ran in all directions, listening in earnest, yet refusing to respond to such petty human intrusions. The utterance might have dissolved in the hot desert air, but it was not lost. Sarat's device captured it, and out of prudence, covered it in linguistic disguise. With the first potent allegation set free, a rush of words welled up, anxious for liberation. Like a mass of incarcerated maxims, held back by the weight of fear and dogmatic tradition, they broke out. Resentment towards years of immoral rule and political injustice grew into bold accusations, unleashed with his newfound liberation. Col 2 is a forgiving planet. Sarat's tongue moved with serpentine eloquence. The elders do not travel the rolling sands here, where limbs sink in gravitational embrace. They do not relish the touch of wind on sheltered skin. A tickle of current cooled the perspiration dappling his face. He ran his forearm along a pocked cheek, wiping the sweat back over his close-cropped red hair. Compared to the interior world of the Finns, the dunes were visceral and potent. His body came alive in response to the desert's empirical impositions. With a dexterous shove of his elbow, he adjusted the loose-fitting black robe where sweat stuck to its side. The tablet rose to his mouth once more. The wind is the lifeblood. the center of worship. It nourishes us with profit, but it is also our burden. He squinted, recovering his vision from the shelter of his eyelids. How do I know this? I dare to leave the confines, the refuge of human intrusion and dominance. I have done so many times. I do it now. He strode along, swinging the hand with the sandals at his side. Freedom reigned out here. A form of liberation sang in the silence that he found nowhere else. There were always lessons to be learned in the desert, some revelatory, others horrors.
Thank you. So your worlds have a really rich variety of both flora and fauna and even microbes in some cases. Not going to give a spoiler on that one, but I thought that was really cool. But there are no sentient species other than humans. And
Yeah.
I was curious, what made you decide to exclude alien species in this particular story?
It's funny, I was on another podcast and this came up too. It was with Adrian Tchaikovsky, which was like a thrill for me, right? Who's like alien spider, right? Writer. I'm gonna answer that in a roundabout way and say it wasn't a decision not to include aliens. I don't think it ever explicitly came up where I had to make a decision to be like, there's not going to be aliens here. I think I just world build, and for me, I am a human only world imaginer and world builder, at least to this point as a writer. And I think part of that is driven by the fact that I'm extremely interested in ethics around human morality and human knowledge. And I think a lot of that comes from the way I take past human history and tradition and culture and riff off of it in a secondary world. And so for me, the problems that I'm interested in and focused on are human problems. Also, I think I just don't have that gift. I think a lot of writers have an amazing gift to step outside, right, of the biological human frame and be able to imagine and write from that perspective. I don't really, even when I think about trying to write, like if you were to say, write a flash fiction about an alien species, I'd really struggle, I think. I don't think it's a natural, it doesn't come naturally to me, which is interesting. So yeah, so I mean, there's a kind of a rift and a divorce from Earth history in the space opera series, this one, but there is no first contact narrative up to this point for them in their part of the galaxy. They're simply another, another upspring of human civilization out in space. It's an interesting question that I don't have a good answer for it, except I just don't vibe it.
Fair enough. I'm going to be challenging you to write flash fiction with aliens in it, though. I'm going to have to do that to you because I disagree that you won't do it well.
It's interesting when I think about the kinds of science fiction that I like watching too, even like and reading about and the movies I'm drawn to, and most of those are non-alien science fiction narratives as well. I'm not a big monster person. A friend of mine is huge. I have a friend who's so into horror and sci-fi horror, and we always laugh and joke about, like he and I are just so different that way. It's interesting because there is so much you can do with it, but I also think it's such a difficult thing to do well. To really be sensitive to all of the important things that you need to be sensitive to. I think writing an alien species, it's really impressive when people can do it. None do it really. Not too many do it better than Adrian Tchaikovsky either. Yeah.
And just on a side note, out of curiosity, do you think we're alone?
I have no idea. Those kinds of questions overwhelm me, Jean-Paul. I read Star Maker recently, from the 30s, I think it was, and that's like, it's that scene in 2001, when Bowman towards the end there, and he's like, having that interdimensional moment, and like, he's got this look of pure joy on his face, and then a moment later it flashes back and he's got this look of absolute horror on his face. I feel like that's what happens when I think about that question you just asked me, is half of it is filled with sublime wonder and complete joy, at the thought and the potential of it, and then there's this sheer horror, right, of like the vast emptiness out there, and and the idea of being all alone. But I mean, I really don't know. I think Carl Sagan's probably right. There has to be something else out there. We can't just be a mote of dust, right?
It's natural for it to bring up conflicting feelings.
What do you think? Really quickly.
In an infinite cosmos, I think there's infinite possibility. Everything is probably happening.
Yeah.
You're interviewing me in a world far.
Yeah, I was going to say there's probably five Jean Pauls and 5 Jonathans, right? Yeah.
Well, if it's infinite, there's infinite amounts of us.
That's right.
But back to the Wind Tide trilogy. We'll carry that conversation on another time. And back to Earth and humans. What parallels, if you're comfortable talking about this, from Earth societies did you use when creating the politics and power structures of your galactic empires in the series?
Yeah. So I don't. I'm very interested in a couple of things. One of them is I'm very interested in the way that we've critiqued Enlightenment philosophy and thought. And so I look a lot at dialectics and the way in which contemporary philosophy is finding error and fault in Enlightenment thinking. And I used a lot of those models to try to break out of some maybe sort of structures that limit our potential in the way we design politics and social environments. That said, I also am really interested in looking at forms of power, specifically the way different governments can practice forms of hegemony and control in ways that look democratic and look as if they are quite, or exhibit a lot of freedom, when in fact there are different ways control can happen, whether that's economically or in terms of just access to things like technology. Did I model particular things off of particular places or people? No, not really. But I did definitely in book 3, without question, that was written during a time when, I was experiencing a administration which was, quite extraordinary, and there was a lot of rise of, maybe or more explicit fanaticism and references to tyranny going on around me, and seeing a lot of that. And I think that definitely came into play in writing the 3rd book in the series, for sure. But I think there's also the theme of really just wanting to break out of a cycle of vengeance and retribution, and trying to move. That's where the Greek influence comes in, is moving from a kind of a family versus state theme in Antigone in the 1st book, to revenge, which is so strong in the 2nd book, to the point of becoming ugly and maybe regressive. And that really has a lot to do with, the Iliad and the Trojan War and the way things played out with that circumstance. Although the heist is also partially based on the Trojan horse, and that comes up in Johnny's Wager, which is fun. But the 3rd book is based on the Eumenides a little bit, which is the 3rd play in the Oresteia by Aeschylus. And that one is really about moving beyond a cycle of vengeance to establishing a social order where there's a kind of a justice system and an attempt to create a collective, impartial system of law as much as that is possible. And, that plays out in the 3rd book, I think, fairly at times, almost on the nose towards the end. I think, where there's a kind of a moment where people defer to others who they suggest should lead, and then those people defer to the idea that I think we need to maybe change the entire way we do this, and not choose someone, but reestablish a kind of a new collective approach. And so I think that I think it from I'm going to use a word that I don't like, but meta, kind of a meta perspective. So it's not politically or culturally or historically specific. It's more about the structures of power. That's might have been very abstract, sorry, but that's how I think about it.
Not at all. And I appreciated the message of hope that came with that throughout the books, and the changes that need to be made in human culture, whether in space or in ours, but also the realism of what a difficult challenge that is, not just for culture at large, but for the individual not to behave in that way. And I loved those conflicts within the character. Particularly book 3 did this well.
Yeah, there was, I was just going to say to that, you know, the hope thing was really, I'm glad you said that, because the hope thing in book 3 is really important to me. It really is, you know, it's just really important that at the end there, that hope is present, which is really great.
It did not feel naive, as introductions of hope can come off sometimes in literature. And the next question, this is something that I love and enjoy when books contain fictitious books, and some of the most heartbreaking scenes in the series for me were some of the ones that revolved around these fictitious books. So throughout the Wind Tide series, fictitious books play a fairly major role, or at least that's how I read it. Can you tell us about these fictitious books a little bit without giving spoilers to the audience?
Sure.
And what made you decide to use these imaginary objects as plot points?
Yeah. Two ways. I love old books. I love it's, I'm an art historian. I mean, like, you know, and I'm a contemporary art historian, which is a weird way of saying what you do, but you know, I love old books. I love archives. And so, you know, writing lost books that you find, you know, that's part of the research process. It's part of the joy of being a historian, is going and seeking out and finding those things. There's a romanticized aspect to it. And so having these lost books, right, in the narrative that, you know, are missing, you know, and you know, potentially there's no more of them right out there, and then being able to potentially find them is just it's a fun subplot for me. And I really enjoy that. I also like the idea of, and this goes back to the world building thing, of this idea of making a sweeping series of epics, the idea of knowledge. I'm really interested in the idea of a kind of anti-progressive model where we just tend to be prejudicial a little bit about the idea that like something's really just getting better and that we're always moving forward in improving our knowledge. And, you know, I wanted to take this kind of a cycle where, you know, maybe a past age had reached a point where they had attained a kind of a knowledge, but then it had fallen off. And maybe if we could get our hands on that, it might be enlightening to us. And so I built that in those books. The Book of Sin Quinty, for example, functions in that way. And then there's Razor's book too, that Razor's writing. You know, I mean, the beginning of Goodbye to the Sun is Razor writing down a kind of memoir, which is another book within a book. And it's an interesting device that I really like. You know, the other thing about the book is the book has an intimacy because it is attached to a bloodline for one of the characters. And so the book is penned right by, you know, a character's relative. And so there's this other intimate level to the book, which I really like. And you know, there's this thing I do with my students a lot where we talk about like older photography and the kind of uncanny experience of looking at old photographs. And it's like the ghost of the past is standing before you. You know, you look at these photographs of people who are no longer here, or you watch old movies and it's like, there they are right before you, you know, they're back from the dead. And, you know, there's a lot of people who write about that in art and art history. And I kind of like that with old books. I have that same experience. Like I open a book and if it's someone who's no longer living, it's like they come back to life, right, through the words that they've left on the page. And I love that. And in the book, I wanted to write that. And so I wrote that in there. So for Ilo, you know, this is not a spoiler per se, but for Ilo, finding that the book isn't just finding and getting her hands on knowledge, related to a potential philosophy that might help her achieve a particular goal. It's also about finding, her mother and the last connection to her mother that still is out there from what's been lost. And so that's why I put the books in there.
Well, I can attest that it was an effective device, because at one point, and I'm not going to say what happens, but at one point something happens to one of the books, and I actually got mad at you.
I know you texted me.
Which is a damn good sign when I'm that invested in what's going on in a book.
But I took care of it. Too, right?
You did. No, there was no loose end on that one, but
Yes.
I was emotionally involved in these books.
That's great.
And I love that idea of the book within the book, and not just the writer coming back to life, but I feel like the readers come back to life of that book. When you hold that antique object in your hands, the history of the hands that it passed through is such a marvelous experience. And the Wind Tide Trilogy also addresses that element of the history of a book, and I really appreciated that, of course, being a book guy. So lastly, the hour is almost up, but you mentioned working on a new standalone novel. What's coming up next for you? What are you currently working on? What are you excited about with your work?
So right now I'm making my way through a standalone. I decided to write a single book after writing this series to kind of take a breather. And I also decided to do something a little bit more plot driven and action oriented. So I'm writing a sci-fi space adventure called Stellar Instinct, and that'll be out in November. Excuse me. And that's been a lot of fun. It's basically, I've taken the kind of classic, Cold War espionage secret agent and moved it into a space adventure environment. So you kind of got the space opera environment, but you've got the standard tropey kind of, classic secret agent narrative going on. And to give it a little literary and book element twist, which I guess I just always tend to do, the secret agent is a master spy, but she's an amateur poet. And she really wants to be a successful published poet, but her poetry isn't really that good. And it makes for a fun little subplot throughout the story, because she kind of pens poetry as she's on the job. That's where her inspiration comes from. And so that's coming out in November. And other than that, the audiobook production has begun for the Wind Tide series, which is exciting. Goodbye to the Sun will be out in mid-May. And they're being narrated by someone named Skylar Morgan, who is really fantastic. And really nailed Keen and Razor's dynamic together, and has a great gravitas that I think really works for the series. So I've got that. That's my immediate future plans for the moment.
And I have to ask, having enjoyed the Wind Tide series so much, are we going to see more stories that take place in this particular universe, even if it's side characters or unrelated characters?
Maybe. I think it needs to sit for a while. But maybe it'll come back. It would depend on what exactly it is. I did have somebody ask me to write a patent war prequel. And that was kind of intriguing. There's also, there's lots of entry points, I think, for it. Maybe. Not as of yet, put it that way, but it could be. I actually would really like to write a science fantasy after this standalone. I really enjoy that kind of boundary of science fantasy, and I'd like to write a science fantasy series maybe after this.
We look forward to all those books. We'll have to have you back in November when that's out. Thank you to our audience for joining us tonight. That was Jonathan Nevair with the new editions of the Wind Tide series. There's links in the chat for all of those books. Thank you so much, Jonathan, for joining us tonight. Thanks. And hope to see you in November with the release of your next novel.
Thanks so much. Thanks to everyone for coming too. I really appreciate it.